every single time you interact with a website, you know, logging in, even just clicking a link,
Hmm.
that's like a potential conversation, right? And today we're going to dive into how those little interactions, the ones you think are totally
Yeah,
harmless,
how they can actually be manipulated.
yeah, manipulated, exactly.
Yeah,
Even when you're just, casually browsing.
precisely.
Yeah.
This is a deep dive into, well, web application security,
Hmm.
a critical area. We're looking specifically at how attackers try to get around the safeguards,
Mm-hmm.
the things meant to protect your data, your whole online experience.
And we're not just pulling this out of thin air. We've got a
Yep.
ton of great material here, including stuff from real security heavyweights like the Daffod, you might know him as Portswigger, the Burp Suite creator.
Essential tool.
Right. And Marcus Pinto, too. They cover like everything from the absolute basics up to some pretty advanced attack methods.
Yeah, and our mission today, really, for you listening, if you're curious about how this all works under the hood,
Hmm.
but maybe you don't want the super dense technical jargon,
Right.
our goal is to pull off the core ideas and honestly, some of the surprising ways things can break. The vulnerabilities lurking just beneath the surface of the sites you use every day. We're focusing on how attackers think, the clever, sometimes kind of devious ways they operate, and the weaknesses they hunt for, often ones you wouldn't expect.
Okay, let's get into it then. So, the absolute core of web app security, the thing that experts always come back to, it's this idea of untrusted input.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
The fundamental problem, the challenge for any web application, is that it has to treat all data coming from a user as potentially malicious.
All of it, like even just a search query.
Everything. Think about it. Search terms, file uploads, anything you put into a form.
Yeah.
It all needs careful checking, scrutiny.
And if an app doesn't do that, if it just sort of trusts the input, what happens then?
Well, that's the crack, isn't it? That failure, that misplaced trust, it's the first opening attackers looks for, and they will try to exploit it.
Okay. Now, one place where this whole untrusted input thing really shows up is with client-side controls. Chapter 5 in our sources goes into this. These are the security bits running in your browser, right?
That's right. And what's interesting, or maybe worrying, is how inherently weak that reliance is. Because ultimately, those controls, they're running on your machine,
Which means,
which means they can be messed with, tampered with, bypassed.
so how do websites kind of shoot themselves in the foot here? By trusting the client side too much.
Two main ways, really. First, they might just assume the data coming from your browser hasn't been changed.
Uh-huh.
And second, they might put way too much faith in those input checks that happen in the browser.
Right. Okay. So it's like someone tells you they locked the door, but you don't actually check the deadbolt yourself.
Exactly like that.
So give me some examples. What kind of client-side stuff can be easily sidestepped?
Okay, well, take HTML length limits. When a form says your password must be 8 characters, or a box only lets you type 50 characters.
Yeah, see those all the time. And JavaScript validation too, right? Like checking an email address format.
Yep, those two. The thing is, those rules, they're enforced by your browser. An attacker doesn't have to play by those rules. They can just craft the HTTP request directly, put whatever they want in there, and send it off.
Bypassing the browser check completely.
Completely. The absolutely crucial thing, this is key, is that the server, the website's backend, must revalidate everything. It cannot trust what the client-side checks might have said.
So anything in my browser can be fiddled with. The server check is the real check.
That's the only one that counts for security, yes.
Yeah.
Server-side validation is your actual line of defense for data integrity.
Got it. What about hidden form fields? Sometimes you peek at the page source and see these fields that aren't actually displayed.
Yeah, hidden fields, good one. So you don't see them, but they still get sent to the server when you submit the form. And attackers, they can see them in the source code too. And more importantly, they can change the values before sending them off.
Like how?
Well, imagine an online store uses a hidden field to hold the price of an item. If the server just blindly trusts that hidden value, an attacker could potentially change that price to, say, $1 before they hit buy.
Wow. Okay, that's a sneaky one. And what about disabled form fields? The grayed out ones you can't type in.
Also potentially risky. Just because it's grayed out in your browser view doesn't mean the data isn't submitted. Often it is, and the server might still process it. Think about maybe a disabled field showing the product name you're ordering. Gets sent with the rest of the order, If an attacker can intercept and modify that request before it hits the server, maybe inject some malicious code into that disabled field's value.
Then you could have things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting, even from a field you couldn't type in.
Exactly.
Wow.
If the server processes it without proper checks.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I remember reading about something called view state in ASP.NET. That sounds a bit more complex. Can attackers mess with that too?
View state, yeah. It's how ASP.NET tries to keep track of page state between requests. Now, it often has protection against tampering, like a MA, a machine authentication check.
Okay, so it's protected.
Protected against tampering, maybe, but the data inside it might still be sensitive. And sometimes it's just base 64 encoded, not truly encrypted. So an attacker might be able to decode it and read valuable info, even if they can't easily change it.
So information leakage, even if they can't modify the state.
Potential, yes.
You also mentioned the difference between lightweight and heavyweight client controls,
Okay.
HTML and JavaScript versus what?
Right. Lightweight is your standard HTML JavaScript.
Mm.
Easy to bypass, as we've seen. Heavyweight controls are things like Java applets, ActiveX controls, even older tech like Flash.
Do they offer better security?
They look more complex, maybe more secure, but at the end of the day, they're still running client-side. They can be reverse engineered. Their logic can be figured out and bypassed.
Cow.
Think of a web game using an applet. Maybe it calculates your score, tries to obfuscate it somehow, then sends it to the server. An attacker could potentially decompile that applet, see exactly how the score is being hidden or calculated.
And then just send fake high scores bypassing the applet entirely.
Precisely. There are tools specifically for decompiling Java, analyzing Flash objects, modifying bytecode. So even heavyweight controls aren't a security guarantee.
So the big takeaway on client-side stuff is it's mostly for looks.
Right.
Or usability.
Pretty much. It's primarily for user convenience, catching typos early, improving perceived performance.
But not actual security?
Definitely not the core of security. Think of it as a polite suggestion, easily ignored by someone determined. The real security muscle has to be on the server.
Okay. Let's shift gears then. Authentication. Chapter 6 highlights this as a prime target. Why is logging in so critical for attackers?
Well, think about it. Authentication is the front door. If an attacker gets past that, they potentially have access to everything behind it. User accounts, private data, special features.
The keys to the kingdom.
Essentially, yeah. A weak authentication system undermines everything else. The core idea here is that your security is only as strong as that authentication process. It needs to be solid from every angle, how credentials are sent, stored, even how password resets work.
So what are the common weak spots? What do attackers look for?
Oh, several things. One really basic one, but still pops up. Clear text transmission of credentials. Sending usernames and passwords without encryption.
Like overplain HTTP?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or even seeing login details right in the URL sometimes. Our sources mention that, and it's, a major red flag.
But wait, if the site has the little padlock, HTTPS, isn't it okay then?
Not necessarily for the login form itself.
Yeah.
If the page with the form is loaded over HTTPS, great. But if the form submits its data, say, back to an HTTP URL, or parts of the login process somehow happen over HTTP, you're still exposed. HTTPS needs to cover the entire process.
Wow. Still happens, huh? Okay, what else?
Predictable credentials. This is a big one. Weak password rules. Easily guessed defaults. It just invites brute force attacks.
Just trying millions of passwords?
Well, yeah, or common ones. Then there's username enumeration.
What's that?
It's where an attacker can figure out valid usernames on the system. Maybe the registration page says username already taken, or maybe the login page gives a different error message if the username exists but the password was wrong, versus if the username itself doesn't exist.
Ah, so the error messages leak information.
They can, yeah. It helps attackers build a list of valid targets.
And then they can focus their attacks on those known usernames. What about hitting the login process directly?
Yeah, brute force attacks, like we mentioned, just hammering the login form with username password pairs. That's why things like account lockout mechanisms are important, blocking an account after too many failed tries.
But those can be tricky too, right? Lock everyone out.
They need careful implementation, definitely. You don't want an attacker to be able to easily cause a denial of service by locking out legitimate users.
Okay. What about those remember me checkboxes? Convenient, but risky.
Can be very risky depending on how they're implemented.
Yeah.
Some just drop a simple persistent cookie, maybe with your username, maybe something else predictable. The application then just trusts that cookie next time, bypassing the login completely.
So if someone steals that cookie.
They're in. No password needed.
Yeah.
Full access.
Yikes.
Yep. And then you have weaknesses in password resets and security questions. If that whole recovery process isn't secure, attackers can hijack accounts by manipulating the reset flow or guessing easy answers.
Like, what was your first pet's name?
Stuff like that, yeah. Or even just the way error messages are phrased during authentication, leaking info about whether a username is valid or not.
Yeah.
Subtle stuff, but
Yeah.
attackers use it.
So, bottom line for secure authentication.
Use HTTPS everywhere. For the form, for the submission, for everything sensitive. Don't roll your own crypto. Use established standards like TLS.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fundamental.
Right. So once you are logged in, the application needs to keep track of you. That's session management, covered in Chapter 7, and that's another attack surface.
Oh, absolutely. Authentication gets you in the door. Session management keeps you there as you move around the site. If an attacker can compromise your session, they can effectively become you. Session hijacking.
How do they usually do that? What are the weaknesses there?
A major one is predictable session tokens. These tokens, usually in cookies, are supposed to be unique random identifiers for your logged-in session.
It's supposed to be random.
Right. But sometimes they aren't random enough. Maybe they're sequential numbers. Maybe they're based on the time or the user's IP address in some guessable way. Attackers will analyze these tokens, look at the length, the characters used, any patterns. They might log in repeatedly from different places with different usernames just to collect tokens and look for relationships.
But they often look like just long, random strings. How predictable can they be?
Well, random looking isn't always truly random. The generation process might have flaws. Maybe it uses a weak random number generator or combines predictable elements. With enough samples, an attacker might be able to figure out the pattern or even predict future tokens.
Like cracking a code that's meant to be unbreakable.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's insecure transmission. Sending those session tokens without encryption, especially embedding them directly in URLs.
Why is the URL bad?
Because URLs get logged everywhere. Browser history, web server logs, proxy server logs, even in the referer header that gets sent when you click a link from that site to another one.
Oh, wow. So your session token could end up on a completely different website's logs.
It absolutely could. It's like leaving little digital footprints of your session all over the place.
So disclosure in logs is a big risk. What else?
Concurrent sessions. If the site lets you log in multiple times with the same username simultaneously, an attacker who steals your credentials could log in, and you might never know they're using your account at the same time.
Sneaky. What about logging out? Does that always kill the session properly?
Not always. Lack of proper session termination is a problem. You click log out in your browser, but maybe the server doesn't actually invalidate your session token immediately. It might still be valid for a while. There's also session fixation, where an attacker tricks you into using a session token they already know before you even log in. Then once you log in with that token, they can use it too. And we have to mention cross-site request forgery, XSRF, or CSRF. That's where an attacker tricks your browser into sending a request to a site you're logged into, making it do something you didn't intend, like changing your password or making a purchase.
Because the browser automatically sends your session cookie along with the request.
Exactly. And finally, liberal cookie scope. If a session cookie is set for the entire domain, like .example.com instead of app.example.com, or a very broad path, it might be accessible to other, potentially less secure applications on the same domain.
So lots of ways sessions can be compromised. What are the key defenses?
Well, using strong, unpredictable, truly random session tokens is paramount. Transmitting them securely, usually via HTTPS-only cookies. And monitoring and logging. The application should watch for requests using invalid tokens. A brute force attack on sessions often involves trying lots of bad tokens. That activity should raise alarms.
Maybe force a relogin if something suspicious happens.
That can be a very effective defense, yes. Re-authenticating for critical actions or after errors.
Okay, so we've covered getting in authentication and staying in session management. What about what you can do once you're in? That's access control, Chapter 8.
Precisely. Access control is about permissions. Just because you're authenticated as, say, Alice doesn't mean you should be able to see Bob's data or use administrator functions.
And attackers try to break those permissions. You mentioned privilege escalation.
Right. Two main types. Horizontal privilege escalation is accessing stuff belonging to other users at the same level, reading Bob's messages when you're Alice.
Okay.
Vertical privilege escalation is gaining higher privileges than you should have. A regular user somehow getting admin rights. And sometimes, getting horizontal access first can help you find a way to escalate vertically.
How do they usually try to break these controls?
Sometimes it's surprisingly simple. Bypassing checks in URL parameters. You see a link like viewprofile.php.user123 and edit false. Maybe just changing that false to true works.
Seriously, just changing a parameter.
It happens. Or maybe admin functions are accidentally revealed.
Yeah.
Leftover code in JavaScript comments or an HTML comment saying